the long history of the four nations, one name stands above all others, sparking both hope and legend. Aang, born in 12 BG during an era of growing tensions across the world. This young air nomad emerged as the Avatar during humanity's darkest hour, the Last Airbender and bridge between worlds. Aang's discovery would mark the beginning of one of the most influential stories in history. From a carefree child discovering his destiny to the warrior who would end a century of war, his journey represents the triumph of compassion over conquest, hope over hatred. Aang was born to two air nomads in 12 BG, entering a world where the four nations maintained a delicate balance that had persisted for generations. His birth occurred during the late summer months at the Southern Air Temple, where the mountain peaks touched the clouds and ancient wisdom flowed through corridors carved from living stone. After selecting the Avatar relics from among thousands of toys, thereby inadvertently confirming his identity as the reincarnation of the Avatar spirit, he was taken away by the monks who would shape his early years. The monks kept his true nature a secret from him, believing that childhood should remain untainted by the weight of cosmic responsibility. As an air nomad, Aang traveled extensively around the world during his formative years, experiencing the rich diversity of cultures that made each nation unique. The air nomads maintained no permanent family structures as understood by other nations, instead raising their children communally within the temples. This arrangement allowed young airbenders to form bonds with multiple mentors and develop the spiritual detachment that characterized their people. During his childhood, Aang was housed, raised, and educated at the Southern Air Temple under the guardianship of monk Gyatso, who served as his father figure, counselor, and tutor. Gyatso possessed a rare combination of wisdom and playfulness that resonated deeply with his young charge's natural temperament. After some time spent mastering the fundamentals of airbending and air nomad philosophy, Aang and several other young air nomad boys were taken to the Eastern Air Temple for a ceremony that would define their lives. Here, each child chose a sky bison as their lifelong companion, forging a bond that transcended ordinary friendship to become a spiritual connection between two souls. Aang approached his soon-to-be sky bison, Appa, and offered him an apple, which the massive creature accepted with gentle dignity, thus marking the start of their deep and lifelong friendship. This moment represented more than simple companionship, as the bond between Airbender and Sky Bison formed the foundation of air nomad culture and their connection to the element of air itself. Aang's natural aptitude for airbending became apparent almost immediately after he began formal training. He was always able to excel at any new bending moves he learned, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of air's flowing nature that impressed even his instructors. At the age of 6, he was already a better airbender than children twice his age, moving air with a grace and precision that suggested deep spiritual connection to his element. His progress continued at an unprecedented pace, and by the age of 10, Aang had proven himself to be more skilled than his own teachers in many aspects of the art. This remarkable achievement spoke not only to his natural talent, but also to his dedication and the quality of instruction he received from the air nomad masters. The culmination of Aang's early training came when he earned airbending tattoos and the status of an airbending master by the age of 12. This accomplishment resulted from exhibiting prodigious talent with his native element and his invention of the air scooter, a technique that allowed airbenders to ride on a ball of spinning air for rapid transportation. The air scooter represented a perfect fusion of practicality and playfulness, embodying the air nomad philosophy that joy and utility could coexist harmoniously. His achievement made him the youngest airbending master in air nomad history at the time, a record that reflected both his exceptional abilities and the innovative spirit that would characterize his entire life. Throughout his childhood, Aang also visited the other air temples, developing familiarity with each of the 4 sacred sites that served as centers of air nomad civilization. His obvious comfort with the Western Air Temple and deep knowledge of its unique inverted architecture demonstrated the comprehensive education he received. These journeys exposed him to different teaching styles and philosophical approaches, enriching his understanding of airbending and spirituality. The diversity of perspectives he encountered would later prove crucial in developing his unique approach to the Avatar's responsibilities. Beyond the air temples, Aang's travels took him to cities throughout the Earth Kingdom, where he experienced cultures vastly different from his own. In Omashu, he developed a lasting friendship with the good-natured but eccentric Bumi, whose unconventional thinking and creative problem-solving resonated with Aang's own innovative spirit. Their friendship transcended the differences between airbending philosophy and earthbending pragmatism, demonstrating the potential for understanding across cultural boundaries. Bumi's influence would prove significant in shaping Aang's ability to think outside conventional frameworks when facing seemingly impossible challenges, perhaps most remarkably for someone who would later face the Fire Nation in war. Aang also bonded closely with children in the Fire Nation itself. His friendship with Kuzan exemplified the air nomad belief in the fundamental goodness of all people, regardless of their nation of origin. Together, they went searching for a dragon in the mountains, an adventure that led them to save a dragon egg from poachers. This experience exposed Aang to the ancient relationship between dragons and firebending, knowledge that would prove invaluable years later when he needed to understand the true nature of fire. These early friendships across national boundaries planted the seeds of the philosophy that would guide his approach to ending the war through understanding rather than mere victory. Due to signs of possible war approaching and tensions rising between the Fire Nation and other nations, the Air Nomad elders made the unprecedented decision to inform Aang about his status as the Avatar at the age of 12, 4 years earlier than the traditional age of 16. This revelation fundamentally altered the trajectory of his young life, transforming him from a carefree child into someone burdened with cosmic responsibility. The knowledge weighed heavily upon his shoulders as he began to understand the magnitude of his destiny and the expectations that accompanied his role as the bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds. The revelation of his avatar status created immediate changes in Aang's social relationships, as the other children began to treat him differently once they learned of his true nature. They refused to play with him anymore, viewing him as somehow separate from their ordinary concerns and experiences. This isolation forced Aang to spend more time practicing airbending with the monks, accelerating his training, but also deepening his sense of loneliness. The burden of being the Avatar created a barrier between him and his peers that would influence his deep need for genuine friendship throughout his life. Monk Gyatso remained the only one who showed true understanding of Aang's burden. Having been good friends with Avatar Roku during the previous Avatar's lifetime, this connection gave Gyatso unique insight into the challenges facing someone who must balance personal desires with cosmic responsibilities. He tried to help ease Aang through the transition from childhood to adulthood by providing balance through fun during the upheaval in his life, recognizing that joy and playfulness were essential elements of the young Avatar's nature that must be preserved, even as he accepted his duties. However, Aang later discovered that the other monks planned to send him to the Eastern Air Temple to complete his airbending training far away from Monk Gyatso, whom they considered too soft in his approach to the Avatar's education. The monks believed that Gyatso's affection for Aang prevented the proper development of the detachment necessary for an Avatar to make difficult decisions that affected entire nations. This decision represented a fundamental misunderstanding of Aang's nature, as his capacity for love and connection would ultimately prove to be his greatest strength, rather than a weakness to be overcome. Afraid and confused by this prospect of separation from the only father figure he had ever known, the young airbender made a decision that would alter the course of history. He ran away with his flying bison Appa, seeking to escape the weight of expectations and the loneliness of his position. The decision reflected his youth and his desperate desire to maintain the connections that gave his life meaning. Unfortunately, their escape attempt became caught in a violent storm shortly after departure, which caused them to crash into the turbulent waters of the Southern Ocean. Faced with drowning in the icy waters, Aang's survival instincts triggered a semi-conscious entry into the Avatar state, the powerful condition in which he could access the knowledge and abilities of all previous Avatars. Using this enhanced power, he managed to save both himself and Appa from drowning by freezing them both in a protective sphere of ice through a masterful combination of airbending and waterbending techniques he had never formally learned. The Avatar state's intervention preserved their lives but trapped them in suspended animation, removing them from the world at the moment when that world needed them most. The Avatar state kept him alive, though not fully conscious, within the iceberg for approximately 100 years, while the war he had unknowingly fled raged across the world. During this time, his body remained frozen at the biological age of 12, while his spirit maintained the faintest connection to the physical world. The very power that preserved his life also ensured that he would awaken to a world transformed by conflict, loss, and the consequences of his absence. His childhood had ended with his flight from responsibility, but when he emerged, he would face challenges that would test every lesson learned during those innocent years at the temples. Within the protective sphere of ice that encased both Aang and Appa, Time moved differently than in the world beyond their crystalline prison. The avatar state that had saved their lives from the storm's fury now sustained them in a state of suspended animation that defied natural law. Aang's 12-year-old body remained perfectly preserved. His biological processes slowed to an almost imperceptible crawl, while his spirit maintained the faintest connection to the physical realm. The iceberg that housed them drifted through the southern waters, carrying the Last Airbender away from a world that desperately needed his guidance during its darkest transformation. The same year that Aang vanished beneath the waves, Fire Lord Sozin implemented the final phases of his plan to expand Fire Nation dominance across the known world. The ambitious ruler had spent decades preparing for this moment, strengthening his military forces and developing new technologies that would give his armies decisive advantages over their opponents. Sozin's vision extended far beyond simple conquest. He genuinely believed that Fire Nation culture and governance represented the pinnacle of human achievement, and that spreading these gifts to other nations constituted a noble mission rather than mere imperialism. This conviction would drive him to commit acts of unprecedented destruction in pursuit of what he considered a greater good. The arrival of Sozin's comet in the autumn of Aang's disappearance provided the Fire Lord with the astronomical phenomenon he had long awaited. The comet's celestial fire enhanced firebending abilities to extraordinary levels, granting practitioners power that exceeded their normal capabilities by magnitudes that bordered on the supernatural. Sozin had calculated this timing meticulously, ensuring that his forces would be prepared to maximize the strategic advantages provided by the comet's enhancement. The cosmic event that occurred once every 100 years represented a window of opportunity that would not return within any living person's lifetime, making it essential to achieve decisive victories while the enhanced power remained available. With the comet's fire coursing through their veins, Fire Nation forces launched coordinated attacks against the air nomad temples with devastating efficiency. The assault began at dawn across all 4 temples simultaneously, ensuring that no warning could travel between the scattered communities of air nomads. Sozin's military commanders had studied air nomad culture extensively, understanding that their pacifistic philosophy and spiritual focus made them ill-prepared for warfare despite their formidable bending abilities. The Fire Nation forces employed overwhelming numbers and ruthless tactics designed to capitalize on their enemies' reluctance to take lives, even in self-defense. The destruction of the air nomads unfolded with horrifying swiftness across the mountain peaks where they had lived in harmony for millennia. At the Southern Air Temple, where Aang had spent his childhood under Monk Gyatso's guidance, Fire Nation soldiers systematically eliminated every living airbender they encountered. The temple's peaceful courtyards became battlegrounds where the gentle philosophy of the air nomads met the aggressive militarism of their attackers. Despite their spiritual dedication to preserving life, many air nomads fought valiantly to protect their home and their culture, but their individual skills could not overcome the coordinated assault of an entire army enhanced by cosmic fire. Monk Gyatso, Aang's beloved father figure and teacher, made his final stand in the temple's sanctuary, surrounded by air nomad artifacts and the statues of past avatars. Archaeological evidence discovered decades later would reveal that the elderly monk had managed to defeat dozens of Fire Nation soldiers before finally succumbing to their overwhelming numbers. His sacrifice epitomized the courage that many air nomads displayed during their final hours, proving that their pacifistic nature did not stem from weakness or cowardice, but from a conscious choice to value life above personal survival. The irony of his fate would haunt the world for generations, as the man who had tried to teach Aang balance and wisdom died defending the very temples the young Avatar had fled. The Northern Air Temple fell to a different but equally devastating strategy. As Fire Nation engineers diverted the mountain's natural air currents to fill the temple's chambers with toxic smoke, the air nomads' mastery over their element became useless against an attack that turned the very air they breathed into a weapon against them. Those who attempted to escape the poisoned atmosphere found themselves confronted by Fire Nation soldiers positioned at every exit, ensuring that none could flee to warn other communities or preserve their cultural knowledge. The methodical nature of this assault demonstrated the careful planning that had preceded the genocide, revealing Sozin's understanding that eliminating the air nomads required more than simple military force. At the Eastern Air Temple, where Aang had chosen Appa as his companion and learned the fundamentals of the Airbender Sky Bison bond, Fire Nation forces employed a combination of direct assault and psychological warfare. They captured several young air nomads alive and used them as bait to draw their elders into deadly traps, exploiting the air nomads' compassionate nature against them. The temple's unique architecture, designed to channel air currents for both practical and spiritual purposes, was systematically destroyed to ensure that even if any airbenders survived, they would have no sacred spaces left for their cultural practices. The loss of these architectural marvels represented not just military victory, but cultural obliteration. The Western Air Temple, with its distinctive inverted design built into the underside of a cliff face, presented unique challenges for the attacking forces. Fire Nation engineers developed specialized equipment to assault the hanging structure, while their benders used the comet's enhancement to project flames across distances that would normally be impossible to reach. The temple's defensive advantages proved insufficient against enemies willing to employ total warfare tactics that showed no regard for the historical or spiritual significance of their targets. When the assault concluded, the ancient temple lay in ruins, its once magnificent halls reduced to charred stone and bitter memories. Within a single day, Fire Lord Sozin's forces had successfully eliminated an entire nation of people, erasing thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, cultural tradition, and spiritual knowledge. The air nomads' extensive libraries, containing texts on philosophy, meditation techniques, airbending forms, and historical records, were systematically burned to prevent any future attempts at cultural reconstruction. Their unique art forms, architectural innovations, and technological developments vanished, along with the people who had created and maintained them. The genocide represented more than the loss of human life. It constituted the deliberate erasure of an entire way of understanding existence and humanity's relationship with the natural world. The death of the air nomads created spiritual reverberations that extended far beyond the physical realm, disrupting the balance between the four elements that had maintained global stability for millennia. Without airbenders to channel and direct the world's air currents, weather patterns began to shift in subtle but significant ways that would compound over the coming decades. The spiritual energy that the air nomads had cultivated through their meditation practices and temple rituals no longer flowed through its traditional channels, creating disturbances in the boundary between the physical and spirit worlds. These changes remained largely invisible to most people, but sensitive individuals occasionally reported strange phenomena and unexplained spiritual encounters. Fire Lord Sozin's successful elimination of the air nomads emboldened him to expand his campaign of conquest toward the other nations with renewed confidence. His military commanders had proven their ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances, while his soldiers had demonstrated their willingness to carry out orders regardless of moral considerations. The enhancement provided by Sozin's comet had revealed new possibilities for firebending tactics that could be adapted for use even without the cosmic boost. Most importantly, the genocide had established the Fire Nation's reputation for ruthless efficiency, creating psychological advantages that would prove valuable in future conflicts. Over the following decades, Sozin's systematic expansion continued with campaigns against Earth Kingdom territories and Water Tribe settlements. Unlike the swift annihilation of the air nomads, these conflicts developed into prolonged wars of attrition as the surviving nations organized defensive strategies and mounted counterattacks. The Earth Kingdom's vast size and diverse terrain provided numerous opportunities for guerrilla warfare and strategic retreats, while the Water Tribe's mastery of their harsh environments made invasion extremely costly. However, the Fire Nation's technological advantages and unified command structure allowed them to make steady progress despite fierce resistance. The war's progression fundamentally altered the social structures and cultural dynamics of all participating nations. In the Earth Kingdom, traditional regional autonomy gave way to centralized military command as local leaders recognized the need for coordinated defense against Fire Nation aggression. Ancient rivalries between Earth Kingdom cities were set aside in favor of mutual support agreements and resource-sharing arrangements that strengthened overall resistance capabilities. The constant threat of invasion transformed peaceful agricultural communities into fortified settlements where children learned earthbending for combat rather than farming or construction. Fire Lord Sozin's death, 20 years after the beginning of his war, did not slow the Fire Nation's expansion, as his son Azulan inherited both his father's ambitions and the military infrastructure necessary to pursue them. Under Azulan's leadership, the Fire Nation developed even more sophisticated weapons and tactics while maintaining the ideological framework that justified their aggression as a civilizing mission. The new Fire Lord proved even more ruthless than his predecessor, implementing policies that emphasized total victory regardless of casualties or collateral damage. His reign saw the systematic destruction of numerous Earth Kingdom cities and the displacement of entire populations as the war reached new levels of brutality. The water tribes faced particular challenges as their smaller populations and limited territorial bases made them vulnerable to Fire Nation naval superiority. The Southern Water Tribe suffered devastating raids that captured or killed most of their waterbenders, leaving the community largely defenseless against future attack. These losses created cascading effects throughout Water Tribe society, as the absence of waterbenders disrupted traditional fishing practices, ice construction techniques, and spiritual ceremonies that had sustained their culture for generations. The survivors were forced to develop new survival strategies that relied more heavily on conventional weapons and guerrilla tactics. As the war entered its third decade, the absence of the Avatar became increasingly apparent to those who understood the cosmic significance of the missing spiritual bridge. The Avatar's traditional role in maintaining balance between the nations had never been more desperately needed. Yet, no new Avatar appeared to take up the mantle left vacant by Aang's disappearance. Some spiritual leaders theorized that the Avatar cycle had been broken by the air nomad genocide, while others maintained faith that the Avatar spirit would eventually manifest in a new form. These debates took on crucial importance as hope for divine intervention represented one of the few sources of comfort available to those suffering under Fire Nation oppression. Throughout these transformative decades, Aang remained unconscious within his protective iceberg, his spirit occasionally stirring in response to particularly significant events in the physical world. The destruction of the air temples sent shock waves through the spirit realm that reached even his suspended consciousness, manifesting as fragmentary nightmares that disturbed his peaceful slumber without fully awakening him. These dream visions provided glimpses of the devastation occurring beyond his icy prison, but they remained too incomplete and distorted for him to comprehend the full scope of what had been lost during his absence. The iceberg containing Aang and Appa drifted through the southern polar waters for the entire century, occasionally becoming trapped in larger ice formations before breaking free to continue its aimless journey. The frozen sphere remained largely unchanged by the passage of time, protected by the Avatar state's power from the natural processes that should have melted or degraded the ice. However, subtle changes in ocean currents and global climate patterns, partly resulting from the disrupted elemental balance caused by the air nomad's extinction, gradually altered the iceberg's path toward a destination that would prove crucial for the future of the world. By the time the 100-Year War approached its centennial anniversary, entire generations had been born and died knowing only conflict and Fire Nation dominance. The world that Aang had known as a child existed only in fragmented memories, preserved by the eldest survivors, and in ruins scattered across the landscape like monuments to a vanished age. When the 12-year-old Avatar finally emerged from his century of sleep, he would face the overwhelming task of comprehending not just what had happened during his absence, but what it meant for his role as the bridge between worlds and the guardian of global balance. 100 years after his disappearance beneath the waves, Aang's peaceful slumber within the protective sphere of ice came to an abrupt end through the intervention of two Water Tribe siblings who would forever change the course of his destiny. Katara and Sokka of the Southern Water Tribe had ventured onto the frozen waters near their village for what they believed would be a routine fishing expedition, unaware that their discovery would awaken the most powerful being on the planet. The crack that split Aang's icy prison released not only the Last Airbender, but also a brilliant column of light that shot skyward, announcing to the world that the Avatar had returned at last. Aang's emergence from the iceberg brought with it a profound disorientation that extended far beyond simple confusion about his location. The young Avatar found himself face to face with strangers whose clothing, speech patterns, and cultural references bore little resemblance to the world he remembered from his childhood. Katara's initial excitement at discovering another person quickly gave way to bewilderment as Aang asked innocent questions about recent events that revealed his complete ignorance of the transformations that had occurred during his absence. His casual inquiry about visiting the nearby air temple struck Katara with the devastating realization that this cheerful boy had no knowledge of his people's fate. The cultural shock that overwhelmed Aang during his first hours of consciousness manifested in ways both subtle and profound. Simple details like the advanced design of Water Tribe weapons, the militaristic organization of their village's defenses, and the absence of the casual inter-nation travel he had known as a child, all pointed toward a world fundamentally altered by conflict. When Sokka spoke matter-of-factly about Fire Nation raids and the constant threat of invasion, Aang struggled to reconcile these statements with his memories of friendly Fire Nation children like Kuzan, who had shared adventures and laughter with him. The cognitive dissonance between his innocent past and the harsh present created an internal tension that would influence his approach to understanding the war. Appa's emergence from the iceberg alongside his young master provided Aang with the only tangible connection to his previous life. Yet, even this reunion carried undertones of loss and change. The Sky Bison had aged no more than his companion during their century of suspended animation, but the world into which they awakened offered none of the familiar landmarks or cultural touchstones that had defined their youth. The absence of other Sky Bison became apparent when Appa's calls for his kind echoed unanswered across the empty skies, creating a silence that spoke volumes about the extinction that had claimed not only the air nomads, but their animal companions as well. Katara and Sokka's patient explanations about the current state of the world gradually revealed the scope of the catastrophe that had unfolded during Aang's absence. Their description of the Fire Nation's systematic conquest of other territories painted a picture of aggression that seemed incompatible with Aang's understanding of Fire Nation culture as vibrant and creative rather than militaristic and oppressive. The revelation that the air nomads had been completely eliminated struck Aang with a grief so profound that his emotional response triggered involuntary displays of airbending power that demonstrated both his abilities and his loss of control when confronted with overwhelming tragedy. The formation of what would become known as Team Avatar began with these first tentative bonds of friendship, forged through shared adversity and mutual need. Katara's natural compassion and nurturing instincts provided Aang with emotional support during his adjustment to his transformed circumstances, while her developing waterbending abilities gave them common ground as fellow practitioners of the bending arts. Sokka's strategic thinking and practical knowledge of contemporary warfare offered insights that Aang desperately needed to understand the tactical realities of the ongoing conflict. Together, they represented a fusion of ancient wisdom and modern experience that would prove essential for navigating the challenges ahead. Their early travels together revealed the extent to which fear and suspicion had replaced the open cultural exchange that Aang remembered from his childhood. Villages that had once welcomed travelers from other nations now maintained strict security measures and regarded outsiders with deep mistrust born from decades of raids and attacks. The casual friendships between people of different nations that had characterized Aang's youth had been replaced by rigid boundaries and ethnic tensions that made his inclusive worldview seem naive and outdated. These encounters forced him to confront the reality that his absence had allowed hatred to take root, where understanding had once flourished. Prince Zuko's relentless pursuit of the Avatar represented more than simple military duty, embodying the personal desperation of a young man seeking to restore his honor through capturing the most significant prize in the ongoing war. His initial confrontations with Aang revealed the extent to which Fire Nation propaganda had distorted their understanding of air nomad culture and Avatar traditions. Zuko's expectation of facing a fully realized Avatar master was shattered by his encounters with what appeared to be merely a talented child, creating confusion about Aang's true capabilities and the threat he represented to Fire Nation dominance. These early battles established a pattern of pursuit and escape that would define their relationship for months to come. The journey toward the Northern Water Tribe provided Aang with his first extended exposure to the war-torn landscape that the world had become during his century of absence. Earth Kingdom territories bore the scars of prolonged conflict in the form of abandoned villages, scorched farmlands, and refugee camps filled with displaced families who had lost everything to Fire Nation aggression. These visual reminders of the war's human cost weighed heavily on Aang's conscience as he began to understand that his absence had contributed to the suffering he witnessed. The guilt of not being present when his people needed him most would become a driving force in his determination to master the Avatar state and fulfill his responsibilities. Throughout their travels, Aang's natural curiosity about the exotic animals and unique environments they encountered provided moments of levity that contrasted sharply with the underlying grimness of their mission. His joy at riding otter penguins or playing with other creatures demonstrated that his essential nature remained unchanged despite the traumatic revelations about his transformed world. These episodes of playfulness served multiple purposes, offering emotional release for his companions while also revealing to them glimpses of the peaceful, harmonious world that Aang represented and hoped to restore. His ability to find wonder and delight, even amid devastation, inspired hope in those around him. The spiritual dimensions of Aang's awakening became apparent through his encounters with spirits and otherworldly phenomena that had been disturbed by the century of warfare. His intervention in the crisis involving Heibai, the forest spirit wreaking havoc on Senlin Village, marked his first successful use of avatar abilities to resolve conflicts through understanding rather than force. The experience of crossing between the physical and spirit worlds reminded Aang of capabilities he had possessed even as a child, while also revealing how the war had disrupted the natural balance between these realms. The spirit world's distress mirrored the chaos in the physical world, indicating that restoration would require healing on multiple levels of existence. Aang's communication with Avatar Roku during the winter solstice provided him with crucial information about the approaching return of Sozin's comet, while also establishing a connection with his immediate predecessor that would guide many of his subsequent decisions. Roku's warnings about the enhanced firebending capabilities that the comet would grant to Fire Nation forces created a sense of urgency that transformed Aang's mission from a gradual learning process into a race against time. The revelation that he had less than a year to master 3 additional elements and defeat Fire Lord Ozai seemed impossible given traditional Avatar training methods. Yet the cosmic deadline brooked no delay or excuses. The confrontation with fire sages at the Avatar Temple on Crescent Island demonstrated how thoroughly Fire Nation ideology had penetrated even institutions that had traditionally served the Avatar. The corruption of these spiritual guardians revealed the systematic nature of Fire Nation cultural imperialism, which sought not only military conquest, but also the replacement of existing beliefs and traditions with Fire Nation values. Aang's ability to access the temple, despite their opposition, proved that his spiritual authority transcended political loyalties, while also showing him the challenges he would face in restoring proper relationships between the Avatar and other spiritual institutions. Aang's developing feelings for Katara added personal stakes to his mission that complicated his traditional Avatar detachment, while also providing powerful motivation for his growth and learning. His adolescent emotions, frozen at the same biological age when he entered the iceberg, awakened alongside his consciousness and created new vulnerabilities that his enemies could potentially exploit. The romantic tension between them introduced elements of normal teenage development into circumstances that were anything but normal, forcing Aang to navigate both cosmic responsibilities and personal relationships with equal care and attention. The siege of the Northern Water Tribe represented Aang's first major test as a defender of the oppressed, and demonstrated both his potential power and his continuing need for growth and training. His decision to merge with the ocean spirit during the battle showed his willingness to sacrifice his individual identity for the greater good, yet it also revealed his lack of control over the Avatar state and the dangerous consequences that could result from his emotional responses to crisis situations. The victory against Admiral Zhao's fleet provided hope that the Fire Nation could be defeated, while also establishing Aang's reputation as a force capable of turning the tide of the war. The relationships that Aang forged during this period of awakening and adjustment would provide the foundation for all his subsequent adventures and achievements. Katara's role as both companion and teacher in waterbending created a dynamic that balanced his cosmic responsibilities with human connection, while Sokka's strategic insights helped translate Avatar idealism into practical tactics. Even his adversarial relationship with Zuko contained elements that would eventually transform into understanding and alliance, though neither could foresee such developments during their early confrontations. These bonds demonstrated that the Avatar's power lay not only in his individual abilities, but also in his capacity to inspire loyalty and cooperation among diverse individuals united by common purpose. The spiritual implications of Aang's return extended far beyond his personal journey to encompass the restoration of balance between the physical and spirit worlds that had been disrupted by the century of warfare. His presence began to heal wounds in the fabric of reality that had festered during his absence, though the process would require active engagement with both realms rather than passive influence. The Avatar's role as a bridge between worlds meant that his awakening marked the beginning of a healing process that would ultimately transform not only the immediate conflicts, but also the underlying spiritual foundations of civilization itself. As winter gave way to spring and Team Avatar prepared to continue their journey toward mastering the remaining elements, Aang had begun to comprehend both the magnitude of the challenges he faced and the resources available to help him meet them. His innocence had been tempered by harsh realities, yet his essential optimism and compassion remained intact as sources of strength rather than weakness. The boy who had fled from his responsibilities a century earlier was evolving into a young man capable of accepting the burden of saving the world, while maintaining the joy and wonder that made that world worth saving. The departure from the Northern Water Tribe marked the beginning of a new phase in Aang's journey, one that would test not only his abilities as a bender, but also his resilience in the face of profound personal loss and betrayal. Team Avatar's ship carried them away from the ice-covered waters where they had achieved their first major victory against the Fire Nation. Yet, the celebration of that triumph felt hollow when measured against the challenges that lay ahead. Aang now bore the weight of expectations from an entire world that looked to him for salvation, while simultaneously grappling with the reality that he had less than 6 months to master earthbending and firebending before Sozin's comet returned to enhance Fire Nation power beyond all previous limits. The search for an earthbending teacher led Team Avatar through territories of the Earth Kingdom that revealed the full scope of the war's devastation on the largest and most diverse of the 4 nations. Once prosperous farming communities had been reduced to fortified outposts, where suspicious inhabitants regarded all strangers as potential threats, their hospitality replaced by the hard-learned caution of people who had survived too many raids and invasions. The contrast between these militarized settlements and Aang's memories of the Earth Kingdom's former openness and cultural richness provided stark evidence of how profoundly the century of warfare had transformed not only political boundaries, but also the fundamental character of entire civilizations. General Fong's fortress represented the Earth Kingdom's attempt to adapt traditional defensive strategies to the realities of modern warfare, yet the facility's imposing walls and sophisticated earthbending defenses could not mask the desperation that drove its commanders increasingly extreme tactics. Fong's obsession with forcing Aang into the Avatar state revealed a dangerous misunderstanding of the Avatar's role and responsibilities, treating cosmic power as merely another weapon to be deployed against enemies, rather than a sacred trust that required wisdom and restraint. The general's willingness to endanger innocent lives to trigger Aang's transformation demonstrated how the prolonged conflict had corrupted even those who fought on the side of justice, leading them to adopt the ruthless pragmatism of their enemies. The catastrophic results of Fong's manipulation provided Aang with a harsh lesson about the destructive potential of uncontrolled Avatar power, and the importance of maintaining emotional balance even under extreme provocation. The earthquakes and geological upheaval that resulted from his rage-induced Avatar state entry threatened not only the fortress, but also surrounding civilian populations who had no connection to the military conflict. This experience forced Aang to confront the reality that his power could cause as much harm as any Fire Nation weapon if he allowed his emotions to override his judgment, establishing a pattern of self-doubt and caution that would influence his approach to the Avatar state throughout the remainder of his journey. The team's arrival at Omashu revealed another devastating consequence of Fire Nation expansion, as the ancient Earth Kingdom city that had once represented the pinnacle of earth-bending engineering and cultural achievement now flew Fire Nation banners and enforced Fire Nation law upon its conquered population. The transformation of King Bumi's domain from a center of creative eccentricity and earth-bending innovation into a militarized occupation zone struck Aang with particular force, given his childhood friendship with the enigmatic monarch who had taught him to think differently about problems and solutions. The loss of Omashu represented more than a military defeat. It symbolized the systematic erasure of Earth Kingdom identity and the replacement of indigenous culture with Fire Nation ideology. Aang's desperate mission to rescue the citizens of Omashu demonstrated both his growing tactical sophistication and his continuing struggle with the ethical complexities of wartime decision-making. The elaborate deception required to evacuate civilians while avoiding direct confrontation with Fire Nation forces tested his ability to balance compassion with pragmatism, forcing him to employ methods that contradicted his natural honesty and openness. The accidental involvement of Governor Ukano's son, Tom Tom, in their escape plan created additional moral complications, as Aang found himself inadvertently responsible for a child's safety, while simultaneously using that child as leverage in negotiations with enemy forces. The encounter with Princess Azula during the prisoner exchange revealed a level of cunning and ruthlessness that exceeded even what Aang had experienced in his confrontations with Prince Zuko, introducing him to an enemy who viewed deception and betrayal as natural extensions of political strategy rather than moral failings to be avoided. Azula's casual violation of the agreed-upon terms for the exchange demonstrated the Fire Nation's fundamental contempt for any constraints on their pursuit of victory, while also showing Aang that his own commitment to honor and fair dealing could be exploited by those who shared no such scruples. The princess's psychological manipulation tactics proved more challenging to counter than her considerable firebending abilities, as they targeted the Avatar's deepest insecurities and moral convictions. King Bumi's refusal to leave Omashu despite Aang's rescue efforts provided a crucial lesson in the strategic thinking that would be required to ultimately defeat the Fire Nation's war machine. The elderly monarch's explanation of neutral Jing, the earthbending principle of listening and waiting for the right moment to act, challenged Aang's instinctive desire for immediate action and forced him to consider that apparent inaction might sometimes serve a greater purpose than heroic intervention. Bumi's decision to remain in the conquered city as a hidden asset rather than flee to safety demonstrated a level of long-term strategic planning that the young Avatar would need to develop if he hoped to outmaneuver enemies who had spent decades preparing for this conflict. The journey to Gaoling in search of an earthbending master led Team Avatar into the complex social dynamics of Earth Kingdom nobility, where traditional values and customs persisted, despite the ongoing war's disruption of normal life. The underground earthbending tournament that they discovered in the city revealed a subculture where bending prowess was celebrated for its own sake rather than its military applications, providing Aang with his first glimpse of earthbending as an art form rather than merely a tool of warfare. The spectacle of Earth Rumble 6 demonstrated the element's potential for both creative expression and devastating force, while also introducing him to the theatrical aspects of bending that would influence his own developing style. The Blind Bandit's dominance in the tournament arena revealed earthbending techniques that contradicted everything Aang had previously understood about the element's traditional approaches and limitations. Her strategy of patient listening, followed by decisive action, embodied the neutral Jing that King Bumi had described, while her ability to sense opponents' movements through vibrations in the earth opened new possibilities for perception and awareness that transcended ordinary sight. The discovery that this mysterious champion was actually a young girl whose family remained unaware of her abilities added layers of complexity to the social expectations and constraints that shaped how bending talents were developed and expressed in different cultural contexts. Toph Beifong's introduction into Team Avatar fundamentally altered the group's dynamics, while providing Aang with an earthbending teacher whose unconventional methods and direct personality challenged his assumptions about both teaching and learning. Her blindness, rather than limiting her capabilities, had forced her to develop earthbending techniques that relied on heightened spatial awareness and sensitivity to minute ground vibrations that enabled her to perceive her environment with greater precision than most sighted earthbenders could achieve. Her willingness to speak bluntly about Aang's weaknesses and limitations provided a necessary counterbalance to the deference and encouragement he typically received from others who were awed by his avatar status. The fundamental opposition between airbending and earthbending philosophies created learning challenges for Aang that went beyond simple technique acquisition to encompass entirely different approaches to problem solving and conflict resolution. Where airbending emphasized evasion, flexibility, and indirect action, earthbending required confrontation, stability, and direct engagement with opposing forces. Aang's natural inclination to avoid conflict and seek harmonious solutions conflicted with Earthbending's demand that practitioners stand their ground and meet challenges head-on, creating internal tension that manifested as difficulty in moving Earth. Despite his proven ability to master other elements with relative ease, the breakthrough that finally enabled Aang to earthbend came through his fierce determination to protect Sokka from the attacking saber-toothed moose lion, demonstrating that his earthbending abilities were most accessible when he channeled protective instincts rather than aggressive impulses. This experience taught him that the confrontational nature of earthbending did not necessarily require anger or hostility, but could be motivated by the desire to shield others from harm. The realization that standing firm could be an act of compassion rather than aggression provided him with the philosophical framework necessary to integrate earthbending into his overall approach to the Avatar's responsibilities. The separation of Team Avatar during the Fire Nation ambush at the monastery created the first major test of their bonds as a group, while simultaneously exposing each member to dangers that they had previously faced together. Aang's desperate search for Katara revealed the depth of his emotional attachment to his companions and the extent to which his Avatar duties had become intertwined with his personal relationships. The experience of interrogating the captured Fire Nation soldier provided disturbing insights into how thoroughly Fire Nation propaganda had distorted their citizens' understanding of other cultures, particularly the characterization of air nomads as evil forces that had threatened world peace rather than peaceful monks who had sought harmony with all living things. The reunion with Katara through the intervention of Captain Jiang's pirates demonstrated how the war had created unlikely alliances between groups that might otherwise have remained antagonistic, as shared opposition to Fire Nation tyranny overcame traditional conflicts between law-abiding citizens and those who lived outside conventional society. These temporary partnerships reflected the way that extreme circumstances could reshape social boundaries and create new forms of cooperation, while also highlighting the pragmatic considerations that increasingly influenced decision-making in a world where survival often depended on flexibility rather than adherence to established principles. The discovery of Wan Shi Tong's library in the Si Wong Desert represented a crucial opportunity to gather intelligence about Fire Nation vulnerabilities, while also exposing Team Avatar to knowledge that carried dangerous implications for their mission. The ancient spirit's vast collection of human knowledge contained information about past eclipses that could neutralize firebending abilities, but accessing this data required accepting restrictions on how the knowledge could be used that conflicted with their military objectives. The moral complexity of using a sacred repository of learning as a source of tactical advantage forced Aang to consider whether the pursuit of victory justified violating the trust of spirits who had preserved human wisdom for millennia. The loss of Appa during their visit to the library created the most severe emotional crisis that Aang had faced since awakening from the iceberg, stripping away his most important connection to his previous life and leaving him feeling utterly alone in a hostile world. The sky bison's capture by desert tribesmen represented more than the loss of transportation or even a beloved companion. It severed Aang's last tangible link to air nomad culture and the innocent happiness of his childhood before the war's devastation had transformed everything he knew. The guilt of failing to protect Appa compounded his existing self-recrimination about his absence during the air nomad genocide, creating emotional wounds that threatened to overwhelm his capacity for rational decision-making. Aang's rage-induced destruction of the sand sailors belonging to Appa's kidnappers marked the first time that his anger had led him to deliberately use his bending abilities as weapons against other human beings, crossing a moral boundary that he had previously maintained despite numerous provocations. The avatar state that resulted from his fury demonstrated the dangerous potential for his emotions to trigger responses that contradicted his peaceful philosophy and commitment to preserving life. This incident forced his companions to confront the reality that the Avatar's power could pose a threat to innocent people if his psychological state became sufficiently unstable, raising questions about how to support him through emotional crises, while also protecting others from unintended consequences. The journey to Ba Sing Se through the Serpent's Pass provided Team Avatar with first-hand experience of the refugee crisis that had displaced millions of Earth Kingdom citizens during the prolonged conflict with the Fire Nation. The desperate families they encountered represented countless others who had lost their homes, livelihoods, and often family members to the advancing enemy forces, creating a humanitarian catastrophe that extended far beyond the immediate military casualties of battle. Aang's interactions with these displaced persons reinforced his understanding of the war's human cost, while also demonstrating the hope that his presence could inspire in those who had endured years of suffering and defeat. The massive Fire Nation drill approaching Ba Sing Se's outer wall represented the pinnacle of Fire Nation engineering and military innovation, combining advanced metallurgy with coordinated earthbending techniques to create a weapon capable of breaching even the most formidable Earth Kingdom defenses. The drill's methodical advance toward the city symbolized the inexorable nature of Fire Nation expansion and the technological superiority that had enabled their forces to overcome traditional defensive strategies. Stopping this mechanical monstrosity would require not only physical courage, but also the kind of creative problem-solving that combined multiple bending disciplines and tactical innovations. The successful destruction of the drill through the coordinated efforts of Team Avatar marked Aang's first major victory that relied primarily on strategy and teamwork rather than overwhelming Avatar power or spiritual intervention. The experience taught him valuable lessons about leadership and coordination that would prove essential in later conflicts, while also demonstrating that seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome through careful planning and mutual support. The triumph provided badly needed encouragement for Earth Kingdom forces who had endured months of defeats and retreats, proving that Fire Nation technology could be countered by sufficient determination and ingenuity. The infiltration of Ba Sing Se revealed the complex political machinations that had paralyzed the Earth Kingdom's ability to mount effective resistance against Fire Nation aggression, as traditional governmental structures proved inadequate to address the unprecedented challenges of total warfare. The conspiracy surrounding Long Feng and the Dai Li demonstrated how authoritarian control could emerge even within societies that valued freedom and cultural diversity as fear and desperation created opportunities for ambitious individuals to accumulate power through manipulation and deception. The discovery that Ba Sing Se's supposed strength was built upon systematic denial of reality forced Aang to confront the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the greatest enemies were those who claimed to be allies. The reunion with Appa in the hidden chambers beneath Lake Laogai provided emotional catharsis for Aang, while also revealing the systematic brainwashing techniques that the Dai Li employed to maintain their control over Ba Sing Se's population. The evidence of Appa's captivity and torture served as a metaphor for the broader oppression that the secret police inflicted upon anyone who challenged their version of reality, while the Sky Bison's traumatized condition reflected the psychological damage that the war had inflicted upon countless innocent victims. The rescue mission required infiltrating the heart of the conspiracy that had corrupted Ba Sing Se's government, putting Team Avatar in direct conflict with the very forces that claimed to protect the city. The confrontation in the crystal catacombs beneath Ba Sing Se represented the culmination of numerous conflicts and rivalries that had been building throughout Aang's journey, bringing together enemies and potential allies in a setting that tested everyone's fundamental loyalties and motivations. The unexpected alliance between Azula and the Dai Li revealed how personal ambition could override national loyalty when sufficient incentives were offered, while Zuko's apparent redemption and subsequent betrayal demonstrated the difficulty of overcoming deeply ingrained psychological patterns and family pressures. The battle in the crystalline chambers would determine not only the fate of Ba Sing Se, but also the future trajectory of the war itself. Azula's lightning attack on Aang during his attempt to enter the Avatar state created the most severe crisis that the Avatar cycle had faced in centuries, as the interruption of his spiritual transformation threatened to sever his connection to past lives and end the line of reincarnation that had maintained global balance for millennia. The precise timing of her assault, striking at the moment when Aang was most vulnerable during his spiritual ascension, demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded mere combat skill to encompass understanding of the Avatar's mystical properties. The apparent death of both Aang and the Avatar spirit created ripple effects throughout the spirit world that would have lasting consequences for the relationship between the physical and supernatural realms, while Katara's desperate use of spirit water from the North Pole represented the only hope for restoring the cosmic balance that Azula's attack had shattered. The weeks following Azula's lightning strike found Aang suspended between life and death aboard a captured Fire Nation vessel, his body slowly healing from wounds that had nearly severed his connection to the Avatar spirit forever. The process of recovery proved more complex than simple physical rehabilitation, as the interruption of his Avatar state transformation had created spiritual damage that manifested in disturbing visions and fragmented memories from past lives. During his unconscious state, Aang's spirit wandered through ethereal realms, where he encountered the four most recent avatars who preceded him, each offering guidance and assistance in repairing the cosmic bonds that Azula's attack had damaged. These mystical encounters remained largely forgotten when he finally awakened leaving only vague impressions of profound conversations and ancient wisdom that had helped restore his connection to the Avatar cycle. Aang's awakening aboard the commandeered Fire Nation ship brought immediate confusion as his newly grown hair and unfamiliar surroundings suggested that he had been captured by enemies rather than rescued by friends. The sight of his own reflection, showing hair where his traditional air nomad tattoos had always been visible, created a moment of identity crisis that reflected deeper uncertainties about his role and purpose in a world that seemed increasingly foreign to his peaceful nature. Katara's patient explanations about their circumstances and the time that had passed during his recovery gradually oriented him to their current situation, while also revealing the extent to which his friends had risked everything to preserve his life and maintain hope for ultimate victory against the Fire Nation. The Fire Nation disguises that Team Avatar had adopted during Aang's recovery represented more than simple camouflage. They symbolized the fundamental transformation that the prolonged conflict had wrought upon their identities and relationships with their own cultural heritage. Aang's discomfort with wearing Fire Nation clothing and adopting Fire Nation customs reflected his deep-seated associations between that nation and the genocide of his people, while also highlighting the psychological complexity of maintaining humanitarian ideals toward enemies who had committed unforgivable atrocities. The irony of seeking refuge within the very society that had destroyed everything he held dear forced him to confront the possibility that individuals within the Fire Nation might be as much victims of their government's policies as those who suffered under Fire Nation occupation. The team's preparation for the day of Black Sun invasion required them to balance their natural desire for immediate action against the strategic necessity of maintaining their cover until the eclipse neutralized Fire Nation firebending advantages. This period of enforced waiting provided Aang with time to process the traumatic events at Ba Sing Se, while also grappling with the reality that his next confrontation with Fire Lord Ozai would likely determine the outcome of the entire war. The pressure of carrying such enormous responsibility weighed heavily upon his shoulders, particularly given his recent experience with near death and the knowledge that another failure might result in consequences too terrible to contemplate. The mysterious assassin known as Combustion Man represented a new category of threat that Team Avatar had not previously encountered, combining advanced firebending techniques with mechanical augmentation to create destructive capabilities that exceeded those of conventional benders. His relentless pursuit across multiple Fire Nation territories demonstrated the extent to which Fire Lord Ozai was willing to invest resources in eliminating the Avatar, while also revealing the technological innovations that Fire Nation inventors had developed during their century of military expansion. The psychological impact of being hunted by an enemy who could strike from great distances added constant tension to their daily activities, forcing them to remain vigilant even during moments that should have provided rest and recovery. The arrival of the day of Black Sun brought with it the culmination of months of planning and preparation by resistance forces throughout the Earth, Kingdom, and Water tribes, representing the first coordinated assault on Fire Nation territory since the beginning of the war. The eclipse that would temporarily neutralize firebending abilities created a narrow window of opportunity that could not be repeated for many years, making success essential for maintaining morale among the various groups that opposed Fire Nation dominance. Aang's role as the focal point of the invasion plan placed enormous pressure upon him to locate and defeat Fire Lord Ozai during the brief period when the monarch would be vulnerable to attack from non-firebenders. The underground bunkers beneath the Fire Nation capital revealed defensive preparations that demonstrated the regime's sophisticated understanding of their own vulnerabilities and their determination to preserve the royal family at all costs. The elaborate maze of tunnels and chambers had been designed specifically to protect the Fire Lord during eclipses or other circumstances that might compromise firebending abilities, showing that Ozai's advisors had anticipated the possibility of precisely the kind of assault that Team Avatar was attempting. The discovery that the Fire Lord had abandoned the capital entirely during the eclipse forced Aang to confront the reality that his enemies possessed intelligence networks and strategic thinking capabilities that matched or exceeded those of the invasion forces. Princess Azula's delaying tactics during the eclipse demonstrated her tactical brilliance and psychological insight as she recognized that preventing Team Avatar from locating her father served Fire Nation interests more effectively than direct combat during a period when her firebending abilities were compromised. Her calculated use of conversation and misdirection consumed precious minutes of the eclipse, while also gathering intelligence about the invasion's scope and objectives that would prove valuable for Fire Nation counterattacks. The realization that they had been manipulated throughout the eclipse period struck Team Avatar with the devastating understanding that their carefully planned assault had been anticipated and neutralized through superior strategic thinking. The retreat to the Western Air Temple following the failed invasion marked a crucial turning point in Team Avatar's approach to their mission, as the loss of their adult allies forced them to rely more heavily upon their own resources and decision-making capabilities. The ancient temple's unique architecture, built into the underside of a cliff face, provided both physical refuge and symbolic significance, as they sought shelter in one of the few remaining monuments to air nomad civilization. The irony of finding safety in the ruins of his own culture while planning to master the element of his people's destroyers was not lost upon Aang, who struggled with the moral implications of learning firebending from enemies who had committed genocide against airbenders. Prince Zuko's unexpected arrival at the Western Air Temple as a potential ally rather than an enemy represented one of the most significant developments in the ongoing conflict. Yet his offer of assistance met with understandable skepticism from Team Avatar members who had suffered under his pursuit for months. His explanation of his change of heart and desire to teach Aang firebending carried the weight of personal revelation and family betrayal, as his decision to oppose his father's regime required abandoning everything he had been taught about honor, duty, and national loyalty. The complexity of his transformation from enemy to ally reflected broader themes about the possibility of redemption and the capacity for individuals to transcend the limitations imposed by their cultural backgrounds. The group's initial rejection of Zuko's offer demonstrated the psychological difficulty of overcoming months of antagonism and mistrust, even when rational analysis suggested that his assistance could prove valuable for their mission. The scars left by their previous encounters with Fire Nation royalty, particularly Azula's betrayal in Ba Sing Se, created emotional barriers that could not be easily overcome through logical arguments or demonstrations of good faith. Aang's own conflicted feelings about accepting help from a member of the family responsible for destroying the air nomads added layers of moral complexity that went beyond simple tactical considerations to encompass questions about forgiveness, justice, and the possibility of healing historical wounds. The confrontation with Combustion Man that finally convinced Team Avatar to accept Zuko's alliance proved his commitment to their cause, while also demonstrating his intimate knowledge of Fire Nation military capabilities and personnel. His successful elimination of the mechanical assassin removed an immediate threat while providing practical evidence that his defection was genuine rather than an elaborate deception designed to infiltrate their group. The battle also revealed complementary fighting styles that suggested Zuko and Aang could work together effectively despite their different approaches to firebending and their complicated personal history. Aang's initial firebending lessons with Zuko revealed fundamental problems with traditional Fire Nation teaching methods that emphasized aggression and dominance rather than the balance and harmony that characterized Aang's approach to other elements. The discovery that Zuko himself had lost touch with his firebending abilities following his defection suggested that the emotional and spiritual foundations of the art were more complex than Fire Nation military doctrine acknowledged. Their shared difficulty in producing flames through conventional techniques forced both teacher and student to question everything they thought they understood about firebending and seek alternative approaches that aligned more closely with their transformed values and objectives. The journey to learn from the Sun Warriors represented a return to the original sources of firebending knowledge that predated the Fire Nation's militaristic interpretation of the art by thousands of years. The ancient civilization's survival in hidden enclaves demonstrated that Fire Nation expansion had not entirely succeeded in eliminating alternative perspectives on firebending philosophy and practice. The Sun Warriors' reverence for dragons as the first firebenders provided Aang and Zuko with access to teachings that emphasized life and energy rather than destruction and conquest, offering a framework for understanding fire as a creative force rather than merely a weapon of war. The trial conducted by the dragons Ran and Shaw represented a test of character and spiritual understanding that went far beyond simple demonstrations of bending technique or physical courage. The ancient creatures' ability to perceive the true nature of their intentions and motivations created a moment of profound vulnerability for both Aang and Zuko as they faced judgment from beings whose wisdom and power exceeded anything they had previously encountered. The dragons' ultimate approval and gift of true firebending knowledge validated their spiritual transformation, while also providing them with techniques and insights that would prove crucial in their eventual confrontation with fire. Lord Ozai The multicolored flames that the dragon shared with Aang and Zuko revealed firebending as an art of beauty and wonder rather than simply a tool for warfare and intimidation. This demonstration of fire's potential for creating light and warmth rather than destruction resonated deeply with Aang's philosophy of preserving life and finding harmony between opposing forces. The experience transformed his relationship with firebending, from reluctant necessity to genuine appreciation for the element's positive aspects, allowing him to integrate fire into his bending repertoire without compromising his commitment to peaceful solutions and minimal harm to opponents. The return to the Western Air Temple with renewed understanding of firebending coincided with increasing pressure from Fire Nation forces who had tracked their location and threatened to overwhelm their defenses through sheer numbers and superior equipment. Azula's attack on the temple forced Team Avatar to abandon another refuge, while also demonstrating the princess's continued ability to anticipate their movements and strike at moments of maximum vulnerability. The destruction of yet another air nomad site served as a painful reminder of the ongoing cost of their conflict and the Fire Nation's willingness to erase any traces of cultures that contradicted their imperial ideology. The rescue mission to the boiling rock that freed Hakoda and Suki provided Team Avatar with crucial allies, while also revealing the extent of Fire Nation imprisonment and interrogation capabilities throughout their conquered territories. The maximum security prison's location within a volcanic crater demonstrated the regime's sophisticated use of natural barriers and environmental hazards to prevent escape attempts by even the most resourceful inmates. The successful infiltration and rescue operation proved that Fire Nation security measures could be overcome through careful planning and coordinated teamwork, while also providing valuable intelligence about prison conditions and the treatment of political prisoners. The psychological toll of constant flight and pursuit began to manifest in increased tension between Team Avatar members, as the stress of their situation tested the bonds that had sustained them through previous challenges. Aang's growing anxiety about the approaching deadline for confronting Fire Lord Ozai created pressure that affected his training and his relationships with his companions, while the repeated loss of safe havens undermined their sense of security and stability. The realization that they could no longer rely upon finding refuge in familiar places forced them to develop greater self-reliance and adaptability in the face of increasingly sophisticated enemy countermeasures. The intelligence that Zuko provided about his father's plans for using Sozin's comet to destroy the Earth Kingdom revealed the true scope of Fire Nation ambitions and the urgency of stopping Ozai before his enhanced firebending could accomplish genocide on a scale that would dwarf even the destruction of the air nomads. The revelation that Ba Sing Se's fall had been merely the first step in a larger campaign of extermination forced Team Avatar to accelerate their timeline and accept greater risks in their mission planning. The knowledge that millions of innocent lives hung in the balance transformed their personal quest for justice into a desperate race against time to prevent catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. Aang's moral crisis regarding the necessity of taking Fire Lord Ozai's life represented the culmination of his struggle to reconcile his air nomad values with the brutal realities of warfare and the apparent requirements of his avatar duties. The advice he received from his past lives reflected different philosophical approaches to the balance between personal ethics and cosmic responsibilities. Yet, none of the previous avatars had faced circumstances that precisely matched his current dilemma. The weight of choosing between preserving his spiritual principles and preventing genocide created internal conflict that threatened to paralyze him at the moment when decisive action was most needed, forcing him to seek wisdom from sources beyond traditional avatar guidance. The days preceding Sozin's comet's return found Aang wrestling with an internal conflict that threatened to paralyze him at the moment when the world needed him most, as his commitment to the air nomad principle of preserving all life clashed with the apparent necessity of ending Firelord Ozai's existence to prevent global genocide. His consultations with past avatars had yielded conflicting advice that reflected different philosophical approaches to the balance between personal morality and cosmic duty. Yet, none of their experiences had prepared them to guide someone facing the specific dilemma that confronted the Last Airbender. Avatar Roku's emphasis on decisive action, Avatar Kyoshi's pragmatic acceptance of necessary killing, and Avatar Kuruk's warnings about the consequences of inaction all carried wisdom, yet none offered a solution that would allow Aang to fulfill his responsibilities without betraying the core values that defined his identity as an air nomad. The sleepless nights that preceded his departure for the final confrontation brought vivid dreams and meditative visions that seemed to offer glimpses of possible futures depending upon the choices he would make in the coming battle. These prophetic images revealed worlds where his failure to stop Ozai resulted in the complete destruction of the Earth Kingdom and the enslavement of all surviving populations under Fire Nation rule, balanced against visions of spiritual corruption that might result from deliberately taking a life, even in service of preventing greater atrocities. The weight of these competing possibilities created psychological pressure that manifested in physical symptoms of stress and anxiety, forcing his companions to recognize that their friend was approaching the limits of his emotional resilience. Aang's solitary departure from their hideout on Ember Island reflected his need to resolve his moral crisis through direct spiritual guidance rather than continued debate and discussion with well-meaning friends who could not fully comprehend the unique burdens of Avatar consciousness. His instinctive journey toward the ocean represented a subconscious recognition that answers to his deepest questions lay beyond the realm of human wisdom, requiring contact with sources of knowledge that predated the current conflicts and spoke to fundamental questions about the nature of existence itself. The act of walking into the vast waters during the pre-dawn hours demonstrated his willingness to surrender, control, and accept whatever guidance the universe might provide. The appearance of the ancient lion turtle from the depths of the ocean marked the intervention of cosmic forces that operated according to principles older than the Avatar cycle itself, representing a direct connection to the primordial era when the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds remained fluid and permeable. The massive creature's emergence from waters that had concealed it for millennia indicated that certain crises required the activation of powers and wisdom that remained dormant during ordinary circumstances, emerging only when the fundamental balance of existence faced threats that exceeded the capabilities of conventional solutions. The lion turtle's patient acceptance of Aang's presence on its shell suggested that this encounter had been foreseen and prepared for across vast spans of time. The lion turtle's revelation about energy bending provided Aang with knowledge that predated the development of elemental bending arts by thousands of years, connecting him to an era when humans manipulated the fundamental life force that animated all existence, rather than the derivative powers associated with air, water, earth, and fire. This ancient art represented both the ultimate expression of bending mastery and the most dangerous technique that could be attempted, as it required the practitioner to maintain perfect spiritual integrity while directly manipulating the energy that sustained consciousness itself. The warning that energy bending could corrupt or destroy those whose own life force lacked sufficient purity emphasized the technique's demands for moral clarity and absolute commitment to principles that transcended personal desires or fears. The lion turtle's instruction that the energy bender's own spirit must be unbendable created a paradox that challenged Aang's understanding of power and vulnerability, suggesting that true strength came from spiritual rigidity rather than the flexibility that characterized his airbending training. The concept of maintaining an unchangeable core identity while wielding the power to fundamentally alter others required a form of self-knowledge and moral certainty that went beyond adolescent understanding to encompass the wisdom of someone who had resolved all internal conflicts about right and wrong. The technique's demands for spiritual perfection represented the ultimate test of Aang's growth from the confused child who had fled his responsibilities into someone capable of bearing cosmic burdens without losing himself in the process. The arrival of Sozin's comet transformed the sky into a burning canvas that announced the beginning of the most consequential day in recent history, as the celestial phenomenon that occurred once per century granted Fire Nation forces enhancement that would enable them to accomplish their final solution to the problem of non-Fire Nation resistance. The comet's fiery trail across the heavens served as both inspiration and deadline, marking the narrow window during which Fire Lord Ozai would possess the power to incinerate entire continents and reduce the diversity of human civilization to the single cultural model that he deemed worthy of survival. The cosmic irony that this same celestial event had enabled the genocide of the air nomads a century earlier was not lost upon Aang, who recognized that he faced the opportunity to prevent history's repetition or ensure its completion. Fire Lord Ozai's transformation during the comet's passage revealed the true extent of his megalomaniacal ambitions as he assumed the self-proclaimed title of Phoenix King and prepared to burn away the old world to create a new one shaped entirely according to his vision of perfection. His enhanced firebending abilities, magnified to levels that approached the mythical power of dragons, enabled him to project flames across vast distances and maintain destructive attacks that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The sight of his airship fleet beginning its systematic destruction of Earth Kingdom forests and settlements demonstrated that his threats of genocide were not mere rhetoric, but carefully planned military operations designed to eliminate any possibility of future resistance. The battle between Aang and Ozai began across the landscape of Wulong Forest, where stone pillars and ancient rock formations provided a dramatic arena for the confrontation that would determine the fate of the world's remaining free populations. The initial exchanges of elemental attacks revealed the vast difference in their approaches to power, as Ozai wielded fire as an instrument of domination and destruction, while Aang employed air, water, and earth primarily for defense and evasion. The Fire Lord's enhanced abilities allowed him to maintain overwhelming offensive pressure that tested every aspect of Aang's training and forced him to integrate techniques from all four elements in combinations that had never been attempted before. Aang's reluctance to employ lethal force, even against an enemy committed to global genocide, created tactical limitations that Ozai quickly recognized and exploited, pressing his attacks with increasing ferocity, while taunting the young Avatar about the futility of mercy in the face of absolute evil. The psychological warfare that accompanied their physical combat revealed Ozai's sophisticated understanding of his opponent's moral constraints and his willingness to use Aang's humanitarian principles as weapons against him. The Fire Lord's casual references to the destruction he had already inflicted and his detailed descriptions of the suffering he planned to cause were calculated to provoke an emotional response that might compromise Aang's judgment and fighting effectiveness. The massive scale of their battle transformed the landscape around them as competing elemental forces reshaped stone formations and redirected the flow of rivers, creating a testament to the destructive potential that resided within advanced bending abilities when employed without restraint. Aang's desperate attempts to end the conflict through non-lethal means led him to pursue increasingly complex strategies that required precise timing and flawless execution, yet each success proved temporary, as Ozai's enhanced power allowed him to recover from setbacks that would have defeated ordinary opponents. The prolonged nature of their struggle emphasized the fundamental mismatch between Aang's defensive approach and the aggressive tactics necessary to overcome an enemy who possessed both superior destructive capability and complete willingness to employ it. The moment when Ozai's attack knocked Aang against a sharp stone projection that pressed directly against the lightning scar on his back created an unexpected breakthrough that restored his access to the Avatar state through purely physical means rather than spiritual achievement. The alignment of the rock with the precise location where Azula's lightning had interrupted his previous Avatar state transformation unlocked the blocked energy pathways that had prevented him from accessing his full potential since the battle in Ba Sing Se. The sudden rush of cosmic power that flowed through his consciousness brought with it the combined knowledge and abilities of all previous avatars, transforming him from a struggling adolescent into an embodiment of timeless authority and unlimited elemental mastery. The Avatar state's activation fundamentally altered the balance of their confrontation, as Aang's enhanced abilities allowed him to not only match, but exceed Ozai's comet-boosted firebending through the coordinated application of all four elements simultaneously. The awesome display of power that resulted from his transformation created elemental phenomena that surpassed anything previously witnessed, as he manipulated earth, air, fire, and water in perfect harmony to overwhelm the Fire Lord's defenses and strip away his illusions of invincibility. The psychological impact of facing an opponent whose power exceeded his own struck Ozai with the first genuine fear he had experienced in decades, forcing him to confront the possibility that his reign might end in defeat rather than ultimate triumph. The climactic moment when Aang achieved complete dominance over his enemy created the opportunity to fulfill the expectations of countless individuals who had suffered under Fire Nation tyranny and demanded justice through the Fire Lord's death. The Avatar state's accumulated fury from centuries of witnessing oppression and genocide provided both the motivation and the means to execute summary justice upon someone whose crimes exceeded those of any individual in recorded history. Yet, in this moment of absolute power and righteous anger, Aang's fundamental nature asserted itself against the demands of cosmic vengeance, as his commitment to preserving life transcended even the Avatar state's accumulated wisdom and experience. The decision to spare Ozai's life while employing energy bending to permanently remove his fire-bending abilities represented a synthesis of justice and mercy that satisfied both the practical need to neutralize the threat he represented and the spiritual requirement to avoid compromising Aang's own moral integrity through deliberate killing. The technique's successful application demonstrated that the lion turtle's teachings had prepared him adequately for the spiritual challenges involved in manipulating another person's life force without succumbing to corruption or destruction himself. The sight of the once mighty Fire Lord reduced to a powerless prisoner served as powerful testimony to the possibility of achieving decisive victory through means other than death and destruction. The aftermath of Ozai's defeat brought immediate cessation of the Fire Nation's genocidal campaign, as his airship fleet received orders to stand down and return to base, sparing the Earth Kingdom from the complete devastation that had seemed inevitable only hours earlier. The psychological impact of their emperor's capture and the loss of his legendary power created shockwaves throughout Fire Nation society that undermined the ideological foundations of their imperial project and opened possibilities for fundamental political transformation. The demonstration that even the most powerful firebender in history could be defeated without being killed offered hope that the cycle of violence and revenge that had perpetuated the war might finally be broken through alternative approaches to justice and reconciliation. Aang's emergence from the battle as both victor and moral exemplar validated the air nomad philosophy that had guided his approach throughout the conflict, proving that compassion and restraint could achieve results that violence and vengeance could never accomplish. His successful resolution of the moral crisis that had plagued him before the final confrontation demonstrated the possibility of maintaining ethical principles even under extreme pressure, while still fulfilling responsibilities that seemed to require their abandonment. The integration of ancient energy bending knowledge with traditional avatar abilities created new possibilities for future conflict resolution that transcended the limitations of purely elemental approaches to maintaining global balance. The coronation of Fire Lord Zuko as Ozai's successor marked the beginning of a new era in Fire Nation governance based on principles of humility and service rather than domination and conquest. As the former prince's transformation from enemy to ally provided a model for the broader redemption that his nation would need to achieve. Aang's presence at the ceremony as both honored guest and spiritual advisor symbolized the restoration of proper relationships between the Avatar and the leaders of individual nations, replacing the hostility and mutual suspicion that had characterized the war years. The public celebration of their partnership demonstrated to citizens of all nations that former enemies could become friends through genuine commitment to justice and mutual understanding. The war's end brought not only the cessation of active hostilities, but also the beginning of massive reconstruction efforts that would require unprecedented cooperation between formerly antagonistic populations and their respective governments. Aang's role in these peacetime activities would prove as crucial as his military contributions, as his unique position as a bridge between cultures and his demonstrated commitment to fairness made him an ideal mediator for the complex negotiations that would be required to establish lasting peace. The foundation of trust that he had built through his principled conduct during the conflict provided the credibility necessary to guide former enemies toward the compromises and accommodations that sustainable reconciliation would demand. The immediate aftermath of Fire Lord Ozai's defeat brought a profound silence across the four nations as the reality of the war's end slowly penetrated consciousness that had been shaped by a century of conflict and suffering. For many citizens of the Earth, Kingdom, and Water tribes, the concept of peace remained almost incomprehensible after generations of families had known nothing but resistance against Fire Nation aggression and the constant threat of invasion or occupation. The psychological adjustment from wartime vigilance to peacetime reconstruction would prove as challenging as any military campaign, requiring fundamental changes in how entire populations understood their relationships with neighboring nations and their own identities as peoples who had defined themselves primarily through opposition to a common enemy. Aang's transition from Avatar in wartime to Avatar in peace revealed new dimensions of his cosmic responsibilities that had received little attention during the urgent crisis of stopping Fire Nation expansion. The maintenance of global balance required more than simply preventing aggressive wars. It demanded active engagement with the complex process of rebuilding societies that had been devastated by prolonged conflict, while also addressing the underlying conditions that had made such devastating warfare possible in the first place. His role as mediator between former enemies required diplomatic skills and cultural sensitivity that complemented but differed significantly from the combat abilities and spiritual powers that had enabled him to end the military phase of the conflict. The Harmony Restoration movement emerged from early meetings between Aang, Fire Lord Zuko, and Earth King Kuei as an ambitious attempt to address the complex territorial and demographic changes that had resulted from a century of Fire Nation colonial expansion throughout Earth Kingdom territories. The movement's initial premise reflected a seemingly logical approach to peacebuilding, the systematic return of Fire Nation colonists to their ancestral homeland would restore the traditional boundaries between nations and eliminate the sources of territorial dispute that might trigger future conflicts. This straightforward solution appealed to leaders who sought clear, decisive action that would demonstrate their commitment to justice and reconciliation while providing tangible evidence of the new order's fundamental differences from the imperial system it had replaced. However, the implementation of colonial repatriation revealed complexities that had not been apparent during the planning stages, as decades of Fire Nation settlement had created communities where traditional national identities had blended in ways that defied simple categorization. The oldest colonies, particularly Yudao, had evolved into genuinely mixed societies where Fire Nation immigrants had intermarried with Earth Kingdom natives to produce families whose cultural loyalties transcended the political boundaries that defined the Four Nations system. These hybrid communities had developed their own traditions, economic structures, and social institutions that reflected influences from multiple cultural sources, rather than representing simple extensions of either Fire Nation or Earth Kingdom civilization. Aang's first visit to Yudao as part of the Harmony Restoration movement brought him face to face with residents whose very existence challenged his assumptions about the natural order that the Avatar was supposed to maintain and protect. The colony's unprecedented prosperity, built upon the combination of Fire Nation industrial technology with Earth Kingdom natural resources and agricultural expertise, demonstrated possibilities for cooperation and mutual benefit that had been impossible during the war years. The genuine affection and shared identity that he observed between families of mixed heritage forced him to question whether the restoration of traditional national boundaries truly served the cause of peace and harmony, or merely represented another form of artificial separation that ignored the realities of human relationships and cultural evolution. The philosophical tensions that emerged during discussions about Yudao's future reflected deeper questions about the nature of balance itself and whether the Avatar's traditional role required preservation of existing structures or adaptation to changing circumstances. Fire Lord Zuko's passionate defense of the colonies as successful examples of international cooperation challenged Aang's inherited understanding of the Four Nations system as the natural and permanent framework for organizing human civilization. The Fire Lord's arguments about the right of mixed communities to determine their own political allegiances introduced concepts of self-determination and cultural evolution that had no precedent in traditional Avatar doctrine or the teachings that Aang had received from his past lives. Earth King Kuei's increasingly militant response to the colonial question demonstrated how easily peace could deteriorate into renewed warfare if the underlying sources of conflict remained unresolved through negotiation and compromise. His mobilization of Earth Kingdom military forces to forcibly remove Fire Nation colonists, regardless of their personal circumstances or family connections, reflected the same kind of absolutist thinking that had characterized Fire Nation. Imperialism, merely directed toward different objectives. The prospect of another war, fought over territorial boundaries and national purity, created the nightmare scenario that all parties had hoped to avoid through the Harmony Restoration movement, yet seemed to represent the inevitable consequence of applying rigid principles to complex human realities. Aang's discovery of the official Avatar Aang fan club in Ba Sing Se provided him with unexpected insight into how ordinary people had processed his role and achievements during the war, while also revealing the hunger for spiritual guidance and cultural renewal that existed throughout populations that had been cut off from traditional sources of meaning and identity. The club members' earnest attempts to recreate air nomad practices based on fragmentary information and second-hand accounts touched him deeply, while also highlighting the enormous challenges involved in preserving and transmitting cultural knowledge that had been nearly lost during the genocide. Their dedication to learning airbending philosophy and meditation techniques demonstrated that the wisdom of the air nomads retained relevance and appeal even for people who had never known the original culture. The transformation of the fan club into the first air acolytes represented Aang's recognition that cultural preservation required adaptation and evolution rather than rigid adherence to historical practices that might no longer suit contemporary circumstances. The acolyte's enthusiasm for learning provided him with the foundation for rebuilding air nomad civilization in a form that could survive and flourish in the post-war world, while their diverse backgrounds ensured that the reconstructed culture would reflect broader influences rather than simply attempting to recreate the isolated monastery system that had characterized the original air nomads. This synthesis of traditional wisdom with contemporary needs created a model for cultural renewal that could potentially be applied to other aspects of post-war reconstruction. The crisis that erupted during the battle for Yu Dao forced Aang to confront the possibility that his commitment to traditional Avatar doctrine might require him to kill Fire Lord Zuko in order to prevent the renewal of warfare between the Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation. The irony of potentially having to destroy someone who had become one of his closest friends and most trusted allies in order to preserve peace demonstrated the inadequacy of simplistic approaches to conflict resolution that relied upon force rather than understanding. The emotional weight of contemplating such an action against someone who had proven his dedication to justice and reconciliation created a personal crisis that paralleled his earlier struggles with the necessity of killing Fire Lord Ozai. The resolution of the Yu Dao crisis through Aang's recognition that the traditional Four Nations system might no longer represent the optimal framework for organizing post-war civilization marked a crucial evolution in his understanding of the Avatar's role and responsibilities. His decision to support the preservation of mixed communities and the development of new political structures that could accommodate cultural diversity rather than enforce rigid separation represented a fundamental break with the guidance he had received from previous avatars. This willingness to challenge established doctrine when it conflicted with contemporary realities demonstrated intellectual and spiritual growth that transcended mere adherence to inherited wisdom. The establishment of the United Republic of Nations as a new political entity that could provide governance for communities that transcended traditional national boundaries represented an unprecedented experiment in international cooperation and cultural integration. The Republic's founding principles reflected lessons learned from the colonial crisis about the need for flexible institutions that could adapt to changing demographics and cultural evolution rather than attempting to preserve static boundaries that might no longer reflect the realities of human settlement and identity. Aang's role in designing these new governmental structures required him to think beyond traditional avatar responsibilities, to encompass direct participation in political innovation and institutional development. Republic City's emergence as the capital of the United Republic symbolized the possibility of creating urban environments where people from all nations could live and work together as equals rather than as conquerors and conquered. The city's rapid growth and increasing prosperity demonstrated that the economic benefits of international cooperation could provide material incentives for peace that complemented the moral and spiritual arguments that Aang typically emphasized in his diplomatic efforts. The presence of benders and non-benders from all four nations within a single political community created opportunities for cultural exchange and mutual learning that had been impossible during the war years. Aang's deliberate severing of his spiritual connection to Avatar Roku reflected his recognition that the wisdom of previous incarnations, however valuable, could not provide adequate guidance for circumstances that exceeded their historical experience and understanding. This dramatic step represented the ultimate assertion of his individual judgment over inherited doctrine, demonstrating confidence in his own moral reasoning that had been developed through years of facing unprecedented challenges. The decision carried significant risks as it reduced his access to the accumulated knowledge of past avatars, yet it also freed him to develop innovative approaches to problems that traditional methods had proven inadequate to address. The process of rebuilding the air temples as functioning spiritual centers, rather than merely historical monuments, required Aang to balance respect for traditional architecture and practices with the practical needs of contemporary residents who brought different backgrounds and expectations to monastic life. The reconstruction efforts provided opportunities for former enemies to work together on projects that served spiritual rather than military purposes, demonstrating the possibility of redirecting the organizational capabilities and technological expertise that had been developed during the war toward constructive rather than destructive ends. The restored temples became symbols of renewal and hope that testified to the possibility of recovering from even the most devastating losses. The establishment of Air Temple Island near Republic City created a new model for air nomad communities that could maintain spiritual traditions while also engaging actively with the political and economic developments of the contemporary world. The island's location provided both the isolation necessary for meditation and spiritual practice, and the accessibility required for Aang to fulfill his ongoing responsibilities as avatar and political mediator. The facility's design incorporated traditional air nomad architectural elements with practical accommodations for the diverse population of air acolytes who would make it their home, creating a synthesis of historical preservation and contemporary adaptation. The discovery of surviving flying bison and the development of new colonies of winged lemurs provided Aang with tangible evidence that the air nomads' animal companions had not been entirely eliminated during the genocide, offering hope for the complete restoration of the ecological relationships that had characterized traditional air nomad civilization. These animal populations became the foundation for rebuilding the symbiotic relationships between airbenders and their flying companions that had been central to air nomad culture, while also serving as living symbols of resilience and recovery that inspired similar efforts to restore other aspects of the damaged world. The care and breeding of these animals became both a practical necessity and a spiritual practice that connected the new air acolytes to their adopted cultural heritage. The success of the harmony restoration movement's evolved form demonstrated that seemingly intractable conflicts could be resolved through creative approaches that transcended traditional categories and assumptions about the nature of political organization and cultural identity. The movement's transformation from a program of forced repatriation into a framework for voluntary cooperation and mutual benefit provided a model for addressing other post-war challenges that required balancing competing claims and interests. Aang's role in facilitating this transformation established his reputation as more than simply a powerful bender or spiritual authority, revealing diplomatic and intellectual capabilities that would prove essential for his ongoing work as a peacemaker and cultural bridge. The years following the establishment of the United Republic of Nations brought Aang face to face with challenges that no previous avatar had encountered, as his role evolved from wartime leader to peacetime architect of a new world order that required constant attention to maintain the delicate balance between competing interests and cultural traditions. His marriage to Katara represented more than a personal milestone. It symbolized the possibility of healing the wounds that had separated the nations for so long, while also demonstrating that love could transcend the artificial boundaries that politics and warfare had created between peoples who shared fundamental hopes and dreams. Their wedding ceremony, conducted according to both air nomad and water tribe traditions, provided a model for the cultural synthesis that would characterize the emerging United Republic and its commitment to honoring diversity rather than enforcing uniformity. The birth of their first child, Bumi, brought unprecedented joy to Aang's life, while also creating new responsibilities that competed with his avatar duties for time and attention. The decision to name their son after his childhood friend, King Bumi, reflected Aang's desire to honor the connections that had sustained him throughout his journey, while also expressing hope that the next generation would inherit a world where such friendships could flourish without being threatened by warfare and conquest. However, Umi's status as a non-bender in a family where both parents possessed extraordinary abilities created unexpected complications that forced Aang to confront questions about identity, expectation, and the relationship between personal worth and bending prowess that he had never previously considered. The arrival of their daughter Kya, named for Katara's mother, who had been killed during a Fire Nation raid, brought both blessing and additional complexity to their growing family, as her waterbending abilities provided a tangible connection to her mother's cultural heritage, while also highlighting the absence of air nomad traditions that could be passed down through genetic inheritance. Aang's efforts to teach his daughter about water tribe customs and values demonstrated his commitment to preserving the cultural diversity that he and Katara represented. Yet these efforts also revealed the challenges involved in maintaining multiple cultural identities within a single household. The delicate balance between respecting Katara's heritage and promoting air nomad values required constant attention to ensure that neither tradition dominated or diminished the other. The birth of Tenzin, their youngest child and only airbender, created both fulfillment and new pressures, as Aang recognized that this son would carry the primary responsibility for continuing air nomad culture into future generations. The young airbender's abilities manifested early and developed rapidly, providing clear evidence that the genetic capacity for airbending had survived the genocide and could be transmitted to new generations who had never known the original air nomad society. However, Tenzin's unique position as potentially the only person besides his father capable of preserving and transmitting airbending techniques created enormous pressure that would influence every aspect of his upbringing and education. The reconstruction of the 4 ancient air temples represented one of Aang's most ambitious undertakings, requiring not only massive resources and coordinated labor, but also careful research to ensure that the restored facilities accurately reflected original air nomad architectural principles and spiritual purposes. The Southern Air Temple, where he had spent his childhood under monk Gyatso's guidance, received particular attention as Aang worked to recreate the spaces where he had learned the fundamentals of airbending and air nomad philosophy. The discovery of damaged texts and artifacts during the restoration process provided valuable insights into traditions that had been nearly lost during the genocide, allowing for more complete reconstruction of cultural practices than had initially seemed possible. The construction of Air Temple Island near Republic City created a new center for air nomad culture that combined traditional elements with innovations designed to serve the needs of a community that included both airbenders and non-bending air acolytes who had chosen to adopt air nomad philosophy and lifestyle. The facility's design incorporated meditation halls, training areas, and living quarters that could accommodate the diverse population that would make the island their home, while also providing spaces for the care and training of flying bison and winged lemurs that were essential to complete air nomad communities. The island's location provided both accessibility for Aang's ongoing political responsibilities and the tranquility necessary for spiritual practice and cultural preservation. The challenges of parenthood proved particularly complex for someone whose own childhood had been shaped by the communal child-rearing practices of the air nomads rather than the nuclear family structures that characterized other nations. Aang's lack of personal experience with traditional family dynamics created uncertainty about how to balance affection and discipline, individual attention and communal responsibility, cultural education and personal freedom in ways that would allow his children to develop their own identities while also understanding their heritage. The absence of other air nomad parents who could provide guidance and support meant that he had to develop his own approaches to child rearing based on principles and intuition rather than established precedent. The pressure to preserve air nomad culture through his children, particularly Tenzin, created ongoing tension between Aang's responsibilities as a father and his duties as the last guardian of an entire civilization's knowledge and traditions. His extensive travels with Tenzin to visit air temples, sacred sites, and places significant to air nomad history provided invaluable education for his son, while also creating feelings of exclusion and resentment in Bumi and Kya, who felt that their father's attention and affection were unequally distributed based on bending abilities rather than personal worth. These family dynamics reflected broader questions about the relationship between cultural preservation and individual happiness that had no easy resolution. The systematic effort to reconstruct air nomad cuisine from fragmented recipes and damaged texts represented another aspect of cultural preservation that required creativity and adaptation when traditional ingredients were no longer available due to species extinction or habitat destruction. Aang's experiments with substitute ingredients and modified preparation techniques demonstrated the need for flexibility in maintaining cultural traditions, while also acknowledging that some aspects of the original culture could not be perfectly recreated in contemporary circumstances. The successful development of new recipes that captured the spirit, if not the exact form of traditional air nomad dishes, provided both personal satisfaction and symbolic evidence that culture could survive and evolve even after devastating losses. The Republic City crime wave, led by the bloodbender Yakon, presented Aang with law enforcement challenges that required him to apply avatar powers in ways that differed significantly from their traditional use in international diplomacy and spiritual mediation. Yakone's ability to manipulate people's blood gave him capabilities that conventional police methods could not effectively counter, making avatar intervention necessary to protect innocent citizens and maintain public order. The investigation and eventual capture of the crime boss demonstrated Aang's willingness to adapt his role to meet contemporary needs, while also revealing the ongoing relevance of avatar powers in addressing threats that transcended normal criminal activity. The trial and escape of Yakon tested both Aang's combat abilities and his commitment to due process and legal justice, rather than summary execution of enemies who posed ongoing threats to public safety. Yakone's use of bloodbending to incapacitate everyone in the courtroom, including Aang himself, demonstrated that even the Avatar remained vulnerable to techniques that manipulated the body's internal systems rather than confronting his bending abilities directly. The necessity of entering the Avatar state to overcome bloodbending control highlighted the continuing importance of Aang's connection to his past lives and cosmic power, even during peacetime activities that seem to require only conventional skills. The application of energy bending to permanently remove Yukone's bending abilities provided a practical demonstration of the technique that Aang had learned from the lion turtle, showing that it could be used for law enforcement purposes rather than only in cosmic confrontations with world-threatening enemies. The precision and speed with which he accomplished this removal, compared to the lengthy and dramatic process required during his battle with Fire Lord Ozai, indicated that his mastery of energy bending had continued to develop through practice and experience. The psychological impact on Yukon of losing his extraordinary abilities served as both punishment and deterrent, while avoiding the finality of execution that might have been considered appropriate for someone who had caused so much suffering. The establishment of a formal avatar training program for Tenzin represented Aang's attempt to systematize the transmission of airbending knowledge and air nomad cultural traditions in ways that could ensure their survival, even if something happened to him before his son reached full maturity. The program's curriculum included not only airbending techniques and forms, but also meditation practices, philosophical principles, historical knowledge, and practical skills necessary for maintaining air nomad communities in contemporary circumstances. The documentation of this knowledge in written form, supplemented by artifacts and recordings, created redundant preservation methods that reduced the risk of losing essential information through accident or oversight. The growing complexity of Republic City's governance and the increasing sophistication of criminal organizations that operated within its boundaries required Aang to develop new approaches to law enforcement that balanced his commitment to justice with his reluctance to use excessive force against opponents who posed threats to public safety. His collaboration with Chief of Police Toph Beifong created an effective partnership that combined her practical experience with conventional law enforcement and his unique capabilities for dealing with supernatural threats that exceeded normal police resources. Their joint operations demonstrated the continuing relevance of their friendship and mutual respect, despite the very different paths their lives had taken since the end of the war. The philosophical challenges of maintaining air nomad pacifist principles while actively participating in law enforcement activities forced Aang to develop nuanced approaches to the use of force that distinguished between defensive action necessary to protect innocent people and aggressive violence employed to dominate or punish opponents. His efforts to resolve conflicts through mediation and negotiation whenever possible, reserving physical intervention for situations where other methods had failed or were clearly inadequate, provided models for combining traditional air nomad values with contemporary responsibilities. The success of these approaches in reducing both crime rates and the level of violence employed by law enforcement agencies demonstrated their practical effectiveness as well as their moral validity. The gradual establishment of new air nomad communities throughout the restored temples created opportunities for the air acolytes to develop their own interpretations of air nomad philosophy and lifestyle that reflected their diverse backgrounds while honoring the essential principles that defined the tradition. These communities served as testing grounds for innovations in governance, economic organization, and social relationships that attempted to apply air nomad values to circumstances that differed significantly from the isolated monastery system that had characterized the original culture. The successes and failures of these experiments provided valuable lessons about the adaptability of cultural traditions and the requirements for maintaining community cohesion across diverse populations. The continuing challenge of balancing his multiple responsibilities as avatar, husband, father, cultural preservationist, and political leader created ongoing stress that manifested in both physical and emotional symptoms that concerned his family and closest friends. The absence of other avatars who could provide guidance about managing such complex role demands meant that Aang had to develop his own strategies for maintaining personal well-being while fulfilling his various obligations to different constituencies. The support provided by Katara and his other friends proved essential for maintaining the emotional equilibrium necessary to function effectively in all his various roles, while also highlighting the importance of personal relationships for someone whose public duties often required him to subordinate individual needs to broader responsibilities. The establishment of formal diplomatic protocols for avatar involvement in international disputes created frameworks that could guide future avatars in their mediation efforts, while also providing other world leaders with clearer expectations about the scope and limitations of avatar authority in political matters. These protocols balanced respect for national sovereignty with recognition of the avatar's unique role as guardian of global balance, creating mechanisms for intervention that could prevent conflicts from escalating to warfare while avoiding the appearance of imposing avatar will upon democratically elected governments. The success of these diplomatic innovations in resolving several minor international disputes demonstrated their practical value, while also establishing precedents that would influence international law for generations to come. The passage of decades brought subtle but increasingly noticeable changes to Aang's physical condition, as the consequences of spending a century in suspended animation within the iceberg began to manifest in ways that defied conventional understanding of aging and life force depletion. The avatar state that had preserved his life during those frozen years had sustained his biological functions at enormous cost to his overall vitality, creating a form of spiritual debt that would eventually demand payment regardless of his continued responsibilities to the world and his family. Medical examinations conducted by the finest healers from all 4 nations revealed cellular deterioration patterns that had no precedent in normal human physiology, suggesting that his extended preservation had fundamentally altered the relationship between his physical body and the avatar spirit that animated it. The gradual weakening of his connection to the avatar state became apparent during meditation sessions that had once provided effortless access to cosmic consciousness and the accumulated wisdom of his past lives. Where previously he could slip into deep spiritual communion with minimal effort, he now found himself struggling to maintain the concentration necessary for extended spiritual work, as if the pathways between his individual consciousness and the broader Avatar spirit had become partially obstructed. These difficulties created practical complications for his ongoing responsibilities as mediator and peacekeeper, since many of his most effective interventions had relied upon spiritual insights and enhanced abilities that were becoming increasingly difficult to access. Aang's recognition that his time was becoming limited prompted him to accelerate his efforts to document and preserve air nomad knowledge, traditions, and practices in forms that could survive his eventual departure and serve future generations who would lack direct access to his memories and experiences. The creation of comprehensive written records represented a departure from traditional air nomad emphasis on oral transmission and personal instruction. Yet, the circumstances of cultural near extinction made such adaptations necessary for ensuring continuity. His collaboration with scholars from Republic City's emerging university system produced detailed treatises on airbending techniques, philosophical principles, meditation practices, and historical accounts that would serve as foundational texts for the rebuilt air nomad civilization. The establishment of formal training protocols for the Order of the White Lotus reflected Aang's understanding that the search for and protection of the next avatar would require more sophisticated methods than had been employed in previous cycles. Given the technological advances and political complexities that characterized the modern world, his detailed instructions to the organization's leadership covered not only the traditional signs and portents that might indicate the Avatar's reincarnation, but also practical considerations about how to approach and educate a child who would grow up in circumstances vastly different from those that had shaped previous avatars. The protocols emphasized the importance of maintaining the new avatar's connection to all four nations, while avoiding the isolation and cultural narrowness that had contributed to Aang's own initial difficulties in understanding his role. The increasingly frequent episodes of physical weakness and spiritual disorientation that marked Aang's declining health created profound anxiety among his family members and closest friends, who had grown accustomed to thinking of the Avatar as somehow immune to the limitations that constrained ordinary mortals. Katara's desperate attempts to use her healing abilities to address his deteriorating condition revealed the inadequacy of conventional waterbending techniques when confronted with damage that existed primarily on spiritual rather than physical levels. The helplessness that she experienced while watching her husband's gradual decline reflected the broader challenge that his eventual death would pose for a world that had come to depend upon his presence as a source of stability and moral guidance. Tenzin's intensive training during these final years took on urgent importance, as both father and son recognized that the transmission of airbending knowledge and air nomad cultural traditions could not be delayed or postponed until some hypothetical future when circumstances might be more favorable. The young airbender's rapid advancement in both technical skill and philosophical understanding demonstrated his dedication to preserving his father's legacy, while also revealing the enormous pressure that he felt to master decades worth of accumulated knowledge in the limited time that remained available. Their training sessions became deeply emotional experiences that combined practical instruction with personal conversations about responsibility, identity, and the burden of carrying forward an entire civilization's heritage. The compilation of stories and mementos from Aang's life into a comprehensive collection for Tenzin represented his attempt to provide his son with both inspiration and guidance for the challenges that lay ahead after his father's death. These materials included not only accounts of major historical events and spiritual revelations, but also intimate details about personal relationships, moments of doubt and uncertainty, and the gradual development of wisdom through experience and reflection. The collection served as both historical record and personal letter, offering Tenzin insights into his father's humanity, as well as his cosmic significance, ensuring that the next generation of air nomad leaders would understand both the privileges and burdens that accompanied their unique position in the world. Republic City's continued growth and increasing complexity during Aang's final years created new categories of problems that tested the limits of existing governmental structures and law enforcement capabilities, forcing him to develop innovative approaches to urban governance that balanced individual freedom with collective security. The emergence of organized crime syndicates that employed advanced technology and recruited benders from multiple nations required coordinated responses that transcended traditional jurisdictional boundaries and cultural divisions. Aang's role in establishing interagency cooperation protocols and training programs provided models for addressing criminal threats that exceeded the capabilities of any single organization or governmental entity. The philosophical questions raised by Republic City's diverse population about the relationship between bending abilities and political participation forced Aang to reconsider fundamental assumptions about governance and citizenship that had been taken for granted throughout the history of the four nations. The emergence of political movements that advocated for Bender supremacy or non-Bender liberation challenged the peaceful coexistence that he had worked to establish, requiring careful mediation to prevent demographic tensions from escalating into violence. His efforts to develop inclusive political institutions that could accommodate the interests of all citizens regardless of their bending status created precedents for democratic governance that would influence political development throughout the United Republic and beyond. The increasing frequency of spiritual disturbances and supernatural phenomena in areas where the physical and spirit worlds intersected required Aang to develop new approaches to maintaining harmony between these realms while accommodating the technological and social changes that had transformed human civilization since the war's end. The industrial development that had enabled Republic City's rapid growth also created forms of pollution and environmental disruption that affected spiritual balance in ways that previous generations had never encountered. His work with environmental scientists and spiritual leaders to develop sustainable development practices demonstrated the continuing relevance of traditional wisdom while acknowledging the need for adaptation to contemporary circumstances. The establishment of Avatar archives within Air Temple Island created repositories for the accumulated knowledge and experiences of not only Aang's own incarnation, but also the wisdom of past avatars that he had accessed throughout his career as a mediator and peacekeeper. These archives included detailed records of successful diplomatic interventions, analyses of conflicts that had resisted peaceful resolution, and assessments of emerging threats that might require Avatar attention in future generations. The systematic organization of this information provided future avatars with unprecedented access to strategic intelligence and tactical knowledge that could enhance their effectiveness while reducing the learning curve associated with mastering their cosmic responsibilities. The gradual delegation of routine avatar duties to trusted subordinates and allied organizations reflected Aang's recognition that his declining health made it impossible for him to maintain the level of direct involvement in world affairs that had characterized his prime years. The development of institutional mechanisms that could handle routine diplomatic disputes, environmental monitoring, and spiritual mediation without requiring avatar intervention created redundancy that would help maintain global stability during the inevitable transition period following his death. These systems also provided opportunities for other individuals to develop expertise in areas that had traditionally been considered exclusively avatar responsibilities, creating a broader base of knowledge and capability that could support future avatars. The personal reconciliation with mortality that marked Aang's final years brought both peace and melancholy as he came to terms with the limitations that even cosmic power could not overcome, while also finding satisfaction in the legacy of institutions, relationships, and cultural preservation that would survive his individual existence. His conversations with Katara about their life together and their hopes for their children revealed the depth of their emotional bond, while also acknowledging the reality that their partnership would soon be transformed by death into memory. The strength that they drew from their shared commitment to values larger than their individual happiness provided a model for facing life's ultimate challenges with dignity and grace. The increasing reliance upon meditation and spiritual practice during his final months reflected Aang's preparation for the transition that would transfer his consciousness from individual existence to incorporation within the eternal avatar spirit that connected all incarnations across time. These intensive spiritual exercises served both therapeutic and practical purposes, helping to manage the physical discomfort of his declining health, while also facilitating the gradual separation of his individual identity from the cosmic role that he had filled for decades. The peaceful acceptance that characterized his approach to dying demonstrated the successful integration of air nomad philosophy with avatar wisdom that had been the central project of his entire life. The final meetings with world leaders, close friends, and family members during Aang's last weeks provided opportunities for expressing gratitude, offering final guidance, and ensuring smooth transitions of responsibilities that could minimize disruption to the various projects and relationships that had defined his career as Avatar. His personal messages to each of his children reflected his understanding of their individual personalities and needs, while also conveying his confidence in their ability to honor their air nomad heritage while pursuing their own paths in life. The blessing that he offered to Tenzin as the designated guardian of airbending traditions carried both love and recognition of the enormous burden that the young man would bear as the primary link between the reconstructed air nomad culture and its ancient origins. The moment of Aang's death at the biological age of 66 marked not only the end of an individual life, but also the completion of a cosmic cycle that had begun with his awakening from the iceberg and discovery of his people's extinction more than 50 years earlier. His peaceful transition in the presence of his family provided closure to relationships that had sustained him throughout his journey, while also marking the beginning of the search for his reincarnation that would continue the Avatar cycle into the next generation. The spiritual disturbances that accompanied his passing created ripple effects throughout both the physical and spirit worlds, announcing to sensitive individuals across the globe that the Avatar had departed and that a new incarnation would soon emerge to take up the eternal responsibility of maintaining balance between the nations and realms. Avatar Aang's journey from a carefree young monk to the savior of the world represents more than simply the story of one extraordinary individual whose courage and compassion transformed the course of history during humanity's darkest hour. His legacy resonates through the ages in the peaceful coexistence of the United Republic of Nations, where people from all four nations live and work together as equals rather than as conquerors and conquered, proving that the artificial boundaries created by warfare and prejudice need not define the relationships between diverse populations who share fundamental hopes and dreams. The restoration of airbending culture through his descendants and the Air Acolytes demonstrates that even the most devastating losses can be overcome through dedication and adaptability, while the enduring spirit of compassion that he embodied continues to inspire leaders and ordinary citizens who face their own challenges in maintaining justice and harmony within their communities. Though his physical form passed into memory, his influence continues through Avatar Korra and the generations that follow, reminding the world that true strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the wisdom to preserve, heal, and unite disparate elements into something greater than the sum of their parts. The statues erected in his honor stand as monuments, not merely to his achievements in ending the 100-Year War, but to the principle that even in the darkest times, hope can illuminate the path forward for those who possess the courage to choose understanding over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, and love over fear. Aang's story teaches us that destiny is not about the power we wield, but how we choose to use it, and that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through the patient work of building bridges between hearts and minds that seem forever separated by history and circumstance.